Welcome back to Villanova Sports Talk here on WXVU V89.1 The Roar. So glad you could join us live from our hotel room. I believe we're in Chelsea, New York.
Chelsea.
Manhattan, yeah, that's I believe the neighborhood we're in. I don't know a whole lot about New York. But it's been a lot of fun. Of course, we still have at least one more day, one more night. Hope you can join us on WXVU. Great listenership last night. Do apologize for some of the technical difficulties in the beginning, but we got that figured out, and we'll be ready to go tonight. So looking forward to it. Villanova taking on UConn at 9:30 p.m. David Szczepanski alongside my co-host Stephen Cain. Great to have Steve with me here on the show. Steve, let's talk about UConn, right? Talked about the first half of the segment was talking about, Villanova versus Seton Hall and how the Wildcats were able to come away with that win. UConn is really, Steve, I don't think they're getting enough credit, and I know I've kind of brought that up a few times about players or teams not getting enough credit in this episode, but this is a UConn team that isn't ranked, right? And when you look at the teams from the past couple years, this team is definitely not as good as those teams, at least on paper. However, with that being said, I am just under the impression that you can never doubt Coach Hurley in March, especially with a team that is as competitive as this one. I think people don't look at the pieces that UConn has. I mean, they have, in addition to them just having good pieces, they have younger players. I mean, Liam McNeely is the freshman of the year in the Big East. Solo Ball is just a sophomore. Alex Caraban is leaving, but they have no problem getting veterans into this program. And for a college basketball landscape that has an extremely difficult time at keeping players for 4 years, right? You think about the Jay Wright years and how he could, develop players and keep them in the program, keep them in a system and build that chemistry. Teams just don't do that anymore in both men's and women's basketball. But the exception is really UConn. Because Coach Hurley, whatever you can say, I mean, what he said to the camera, obviously a couple weeks ago, I'm the best coach, whatever. He definitely doesn't have a great relationship with the media, to be honest. And I think there are definitely people out there that think he's a little bit arrogant, however you go about that. But you cannot deny that he is an extremely good basketball coach. And regardless what you think about his coaching style, his coaching mentality, players want to play with him and play for him. And that is a key part of this UConn team. So, Steve, I just can't underestimate UConn. I think when you look at the teams that are left in the Big East tournament, besides St. John's, UConn, for me, is the team that you don't want to play. I think Xavier's up there because of how they ended their stretch. You could put Xavier up there. Marquette, I think I'm in terms of stock, I would have sold my stock on Marquette. They're still a good team. That's just my personal opinion. I think Creighton's a good team as well, but I think they're both beatable Villanova's played competitively with them. UConn, even though Villanova does have a win against the Huskies this year, I just can't count them out in March at a neutral site game where a lot of their fans are going to make the close drive from Connecticut down to New York City tonight for this game. I'm concerned. I think that there is reason for optimism. We'll talk about that, but I'm concerned. I just can't. I cannot underestimate UConn, and I think that the Huskies have not gotten enough credit about how good of a team they are. I think a lot of, even in Twitter within Villanova fans, I think people are going into the game tonight, don't want to say feeling optimistic, because let's face it, Villanova over the past 3 years, it's been hard to feel optimistic at times. But I don't think it's being talked about enough. This UConn team is still extremely, extremely talented.
I would agree with that, but it's also pretty much non-debatable that they have taken a step back. I think that's pretty clear. If they win the Big East tournament, they'll probably be, because they're also playing for NCAA tournament seeding, they'll be in as an at-large bid if they don't win the Big East tournament. And then if they get in, they would be an auto bid, and they would probably be a 7 or a 6 seed. They'll probably level out at a 7 or an 8 seed. But I agree with you, David. If you're somebody in March Madness or even just in the Big East tournament, in any of these postseason games for that matter, you don't want to play UConn just because of the championship DNA with baked in with Dan Hurley, Alex Caraban being back, also back-to-back national champion. Seems like he's found his footing. UConn, they played a really great game against Marquette, fittingly about 8-9 days ago in stores, and that was a really good battle, and Caraban hit a really good shot. He just took over that game in those final few minutes, and it just felt like it was right as the calendar turned March, very fittingly for this UConn team, and they did a great job just getting that win. But I think we'll shift it. Just looking at the numbers, and you alluded to it, if you had to grow a UConn team in a lab that was definitely a good matchup for Villanova on paper, I think personally it would resemble the team that we're looking at right here for UConn, because they don't force a lot of turnovers, And we talked about earlier in the Seton Hall game how we were concerned about Villanova turning the ball over, but Seton Hall is great at forcing turnovers, top 20 in the country, so I'll give Villanova a little bit of grace. They're in the top 75 in turnover rate allowed, but UConn 271st in turnover rate forced, so they don't force a lot of turnovers. And then second, and Villanova did a great job of this against Seton Hall, they got to the free throw line a ton, and guess what? UConn 324th in free throw rate allowed, Villanova 314th in free throw rate. We actually have the advantage there, which is crazy. Usually Villanova has a real disadvantage in terms of getting to the free throw line, and we see how the games where Villanova, they leverage that good free throw shooting, that can really help them. And then finally, maybe the most important thing to look out for in Villanova, they shot the three ball pretty well in both games against UConn. This three-point defense is not very good. 259th. It's actually worse than Villanova's at 231st. And Villanova, they're now the best three-point shooting team in the country, and they're fluctuating between first, second, third, depending on how each day's games shake out. So really those three things on the defensive end. And then on the offensive end, they don't get to the free throw line a lot themselves. They're a little prone to turning it over. They're really good inside. Terrace Reed leads all reserves in terms of double-doubles. Samson Johnson is on pace for setting a program record in terms of field goal percentage. They have a really good
76%.
Yeah, it's crazy.
Isn't that crazy? 76% from the field. It's Samson Johnson.
Yeah, it's really crazy. And yeah, they.
Albeit he's not shooting mid-range J's constantly.
Yeah,
I got it, but
yeah.
He is a really. He's efficient.
It's Ryan Kalkbrenner-esque. Ryan Kalkbrenner also someone who's very efficient, and that's something you have to look out for. They block shots a ton, but Villanova, they've been a lot better at in terms of block rate allowed. They're top 70 in the country there, but UConn first in just block rate in general. So that'll be a tough matchup there. They're really good scoring inside the arc, really good at two-point defense. But basically, long story short, they don't force a lot of turnovers. They foul a lot. Their three-point defense is very good, and they turn it over themselves. They don't get to the free throw line a ton. All of a sudden, you're up to like 5 weaknesses, and you're thinking, is this still the back-to-back national champion UConn Husky team? Again, led by Dan Hurley. We know that they can turn it on in March, and that's probably why initially the betting line for this game opened around 2.3 point favorites for UConn. It's been steamed up to around 6, and I think a lot of it is just a couple points are swinging in favor of UConn just because of the respect a lot of people have for Dan Hurley and this team in March. But basically, long story short, if this is a team, if this is a team that, or excuse me, for UConn. This is a team that definitely Villanova can beat just by looking at their weaknesses because again, a lot of those spots that I mentioned where Villanova or excuse me, where UConn struggles, Villanova could really exploit those just based on how they played yesterday in the last few games.
I think that's a great point once again, Steve. And the thing that concerns me, and you brought up all the weaknesses, clearly outlined those. The thing that concerns me is their offense, and that they can score 78 points per game. Even in Big East play, their offense has been successful. They've scored 75. Villanova does not want to be in a situation where they're in a shootout. We've said this all season long, where it's in the upper 70s, lower 80s. Villanova's not going to win those games. This has to be a gritty defensive battle that's going to come down to forcing turnovers, and I think Villanova's defense has improved, and they can do so. Yeah. You saw that in the first game where Villanova defeated UConn at the Fin 68-66. But even, Steve, that was led by kind of a lopsided 20 minutes. When you look at the first half, Villanova allowed just 25 points to UConn. In the second half, in that game that Villanova won, as the team split the series this year, UConn scored 41 points. And then it was a very similar theme in the second half of that second matchup between these two teams at the XL Center, where Villanova's defense just collapsed. And, the Wildcats very well should have beat UConn in both of these games, so they had a double-digit lead in the second half of that second game at the XL Center about 3 weeks ago. But UConn, they're coming into this game playing much better basketball. Talked about that a little bit ago in the Open. They've won 4 straight games. They beat Georgetown very easily. They took down Providence on the road, which, as Villanova saw, is not easy. Look, Providence is not a good team, let's face it, this year in the Big East. But when you have to go to that building at the AMP, the Dunk, whatever they're calling it nowadays, I think it's the AMP officially, it's a really tough environment to win. And, then they also defeated Marquette at home, albeit it was, in your home arena, but they still beat Marquette by 6. and then a crushing win over Seton Hall after losing them in the first matchup. They've won 5 of their last 6, including that win against Villanova. So I'm concerned about their offense, Steve. I'm concerned about their ability to shoot the ball 35% from behind the arc in conference games and overall this season. I trust. I shouldn't say I trust because that's a strong word. I'm content with the way Villanova's defense played last night against Seton Hall, and I'm content with the way they played to end the season. But what does concern me is still the perimeter defense. They let this Georgetown team at the end of the season, who obviously lost to DePaul yesterday, was without Thomas Sorber. I mean, it was lights out from behind the arc for Georgetown.
45%.
Yeah, and Georgetown is a worse three-point shooting team than UConn. And all it takes is just a couple, hot, three-point attempts to start falling down for UConn to gain some confidence against this Villanova perimeter defense. And that's what really concerns me. I think this UConn defense you can score points against. You saw that in the first couple matchups. Their perimeter defense for the Huskies is also not good. They allow their opponent to shoot 35% from behind the arc. Steve, you were outlining that. They also will turn the ball over at times. They're -1 in terms of the turnover margin, turnovers forced versus turnovers allowed. The concern, though, just for me, is that this is a team that can really score, and at a neutral site that I think is probably going to lean 60-40, maybe 65-35 in favor of the Huskies tonight. I think Villanova will get some fans to travel up. But I've been walking around the city today. You saw a lot of Marquette. You saw a lot of UConn fans. For that reasoning, I think this game is going to be really tough for Villanova tonight. Because of Coach Hurley's resume in March, because of UConn's team in March, despite having different players. But more importantly, I mean, they have an offense that is lethal, especially from behind the arc.
I would agree. And they're a top 100 three-point shooting offense. This Villanova three-point defense has gotten a little bit better. There were times where it was outside the top 300 or flirting with being outside the top 300 in terms of three-point defense and letting up a ton of threes. But now it's in the low 200s. It's gotten a little bit better. And, again, this UConn three-point offense, it's not as good as you would think because you look at last year. I have their Bart Torvik page up now, and you have the stats that they're good at. They're in green, and then the ones that they're bad at, they're in red. And if this was UConn last year, it'd be all green. It was one of the best teams maybe in the last 20, 25 years.
Well, I mean, they're national champions.
Yeah,
I don't think this UConn team is going to win the national championship.
Yeah.
I want to be clear with that, despite me being positive about them.
Yeah.
I think that's a little bit of a different bar to set them on because they're not as good a team. They're not ranked.
Yeah.
They could be, theoretically. Where I'm just getting to, Steve, is when you look at this game tonight, it concerns me also because UConn is fresh coming into this game, right? They didn't play yesterday. Their last game, was on March 8th. I think it does help Villanova, though, in a sense, Steve, that they played against Georgetown and that they were off for a long time when other teams still had to play in the latter part of last week.
Yeah.
Didn't mean to cut you off there, but just I think to hold them to the bar of last year, I guess I kind of feel like I've said two different things, even though they're kind of, maybe you would say, on opposite sides. My viewpoint, to kind of begin to wrap up the segment, is just that this UConn team deserves more credit than they're getting, but I also don't think it's fair to hold them to the bar of their national champions, or they're even somewhat closely to that category, because this team, I don't think they have that much there. Like you said, Steve, they have clear weaknesses, which they have in the past couple of years, but this is still a team that if they get hot at the right time can really scare you.
I would agree, but the point I was just trying to make is that UConn, they're not world beaters from behind the arc. They're very good. They're top 100, but this Villanova three-point defense has gotten just a little bit better. They've been on a decent run of form. And you think to the last time these two teams played, again, it wasn't pretty, but Villanova, they shot the three ball well. They took advantage of a weak UConn perimeter defense, and they outscored UConn by 12 from beyond the arc. And we saw in that game that it's not just the battle on the perimeter on both sides that leads to a win. Villanova, they lost that game by 7. They choked down the stretch. It was a really bad loss. But if they can do that again, it puts them in a position where, David, you talked about it, that you feel like Villanova is going to do that. They're probably going to win the perimeter battle, and that'll lead to this being a close game. And then where it's really going to come down to is, can Villanova limit their shots being blocked? Can their interior defense be good? Can they limit foul opportunities? And also the rebounding battle. UConn top 20 in offensive rebounding percentage, and then they're similar in terms of defensive rebounding to Villanova, but Villanova are around average in terms of offensive rebounding percentage. So the battle on the glass, the battle in the interior, that's really going to be the deciding factor. I feel pretty good about Villanova on the perimeter. I think they may win that battle. maybe in a small margin, maybe in a bigger margin, and that gives them the avenue to make it close. But then for them to actually win it, they got to keep that rebounding battle pretty split. They don't necessarily have to win it, and then they just have to be solid on the interior. It's going to be really tough, but looking forward to it.
Most definitely, Steve. Our WXVU coverage will begin at around 9:15 p.m. Tonight here on WXVU Student Radio. I do want to give an update. St. John's leading Butler 37-24, 35 seconds left to go in the first half. Steve, I want to transition to women's basketball for the final 5 or so minutes of this segment. Villanova ending the season a couple days ago with the loss against UConn in the conference semifinals. They were able to defeat Marquette, which I know, Steve, you weren't on the show for some time, but even though Marquette was technically ranked above them in the bubble because they had 20 wins, they also had a higher seed. Villanova was the 5 seed, Marquette was the 4. Villanova was a better team than Marquette. I thought that was clear, at least to me. In the first matchup, Villanova was without Bosco and still almost won, and with Bosco, they crushed the Golden Eagles. It was a competitive game, but Villanova was able to pull out a win, which was good for their resume overall. And then the loss against UConn. I mean, Steve, we were talking about it actually earlier this morning, coming home like midnight last night from Madison Square Garden. About, when you look at UConn, you look at women's basketball, there is a large difference between the top, let's say, 5-10 teams in the country and everybody else. I mean, even in the game in the Big East tournament in the finals between UConn and Creighton for women's basketball, I mean, Creighton is a top 25 ranked team, Steve, and it wasn't a game. You know what I mean? UConn played really well. Villanova lost to the Huskies, which I give them a lot of credit, though. They battled in that first half, Steve. They actually had a 1-point lead midway in that first half, and they were sticking around. Unfortunately, UConn pushed the lead up to 10 at halftime, and then in the second half really pulled away. Paige Beckers was fantastic. So was Sarah Strong, who I think is going to have a really talented career at UConn. She's just a freshman and plays really like a senior. But when you look at Villanova, I mean, they're not going to make March Madness. When they lost to Providence, that was pretty much kind of the nail in their coffin. Even if they had won Providence, they definitely would have had a chance. But they would have had to jump St. Joe's, and St. Joe's, the run that they made to get to the finals in the A10, it was a tough matchup for them to overleap some of those teams. But I think there's a really high chance that they get a WBIT home game, Steve. They did it last year. Obviously, they accepted the invite. The biggest thing for Villanova women's basketball moving forward, before I get your thoughts, Steve, is the Wildcats have to find a way to keep Jasmine Basco and the other players in their program. Villanova had a really successful year this year when you look at where they were expected to be after losing Lucy Olsen, after losing Christina Dulce. This was a team that really didn't take that large of a step backwards. You could argue they kind of stayed the same, just kind of changed personnel. For me, though, it is all about keeping Basco because she is an extremely talented player. She is the 6th leading scorer in the Big East. She's just a freshman. She is great. I mean, when you think about Jameer Brickus and his facilitating, ball movement, playmaking skills, Basco really has that on the women's basketball side of things. The turnovers are an issue. I think as she continues to develop, she'll get better. But for this offseason for Villanova, it is about doing everything you can to keep Basco in this program and to find a way to add pieces and not subtract. It may be difficult, but when you look at Coach Dillon and you look at the way this team plays together you look a lot of those games down the stretch, Steve, this year, they were so competitive, and the way that they were able to battle adversity despite being a younger team, I think is really impressive. I think a lot of players should want to play for Coach Dillon. I think it's just a matter of, does Villanova have the money and the resources to do that for women's basketball? In my opinion, they should, but I just don't know in terms of the offseason outlook if they are able to hold on to some of these players like Basco and also add to their team, which was already, a pretty solid season overall for the Wildcats.
The portal is really going to be huge for this team because just looking at the roster, you have Jasmine Bosco, Maddie Weber, too, being a sophomore. Can you bring her back as she enters the upperclassman part of her career? Had another pretty solid season, was generally pretty efficient in most ways, didn't turn the ball over a ton. But then you look at a lot of these other players, you're going to have to really, really replace a lot of players on this team. Danae Carter, Laura Edmondson.
Who will return. It seems like Danae Carter will return as a graduate student. I know that Coach Dillon talked about that in a post-game press conference a couple weeks ago at the Finn, that there wasn't anything official, but Danae was there with her, and it seemed like there was a mutual interest about Danae coming back, which, Steve, not to cut you off, but just bringing up Carter quickly, this was really her second full season that she was fully healthy. And
a lot of injuries.
And you look at, her success this year. I mean, this is a Villanova team that, Steve, does not have a lot of size at all. And Danae Carter, what she's able to do, we talked about it before, buddy, she plays taller than what she actually is. And, that's a big part for this Villanova, paint presence. It's a big part for the forwards for this team. Carter, if she does officially come back, which 99% sure that she will, that is in itself a huge way to go into next season.
But regardless, Laura Edmondson, Maddie Burke, Brona Power Cassidy, Caitlin Oriole, and then Jelaya Green and others for Villanova, you're really going to have to replace a lot of those players. You have Rachel Wirtz and Danny Cesaretti that are freshmen. They'll probably have expanded roles, assuming they stay next year, but you're really going to have to hit the portal, find some additional players. But in terms of the season, I think it's been a fine year, and obviously there's still some things up in the air depending on how they do in the WBIT. But I think last year honestly was probably more of a disappointment because you had Lucy Olson, you had Christina Dulce, and you didn't make March Madness. Lucy Olson was one of the best players in the country. Christina Dulce, one of the best individual offensive rebounders in the country, anchoring a pretty poor team-wise offensive rebounding unit. You didn't make March Madness. You played well in the WBIT, though, which made things a little bit better, but that kind of left a poor taste in your mouth. And then a bunch of those players leave. It's definitely a heartbreaking situation. You bring in Jasmine Bosco and then Maddie Weber, hoping that she takes a sophomore leap, and the expectations were a little bit lower for this team. I think making March Madness would have been huge. It really would have been just with a really new crop of players, and then a lot of players on their final season, and they fell just short of that goal. You mentioned it. 2 losses that really killed them: Providence and then Temple back in December, both quad 4 losses. And the Big East in the women's department, you have UConn, you have some other teams, but there was a bunch of quad 4 games. Villanova won most of them, but that does bring down just your strength of schedule. So that does explain why, even though their non-conference schedule was pretty difficult, and they did lose outside of those 2 games, all their other losses were quad 1 or quad 2 losses. So not terrible losses, but just the sheer number of losses. They're now at 14, and the fact that the Big East schedule, you really look at this, right? DePaul quad 3, Xavier quad 4, Georgetown quad 4, Providence quad 4, Butler quad 4. That was a run from February 12th to February 26th, and you won 4 out of those 5, and you lost against Providence, and the Providence loss kills you. But also, and we talk about this with the men's team a lot, you're licking your chops for those quad 1 opportunities. That's what the at-large game is all about, and that's why you see other teams try to little malfunction.
Yeah,
there.
Little malfunction.
Yeah.
We're working on a small location.
Very
here.
small
Steve.
location. but that's why teams want to be in these really good conferences. And the Big East is very top heavy in terms of women's basketball. So you get your opportunities against UConn, but UConn's so much better than everyone else. It's almost a guaranteed loss. And Creighton's pretty good, Marquette's pretty good, but besides that, a lot of it's quad 3, quad 4 opportunities, at least from Villanova's perspective. They win a bunch of those games, but they're not really needle movers, and that just makes those quad 4 losses hurt that much more.
That Temple loss was the most tough loss of the season. Well, probably the Providence
terrible
loss. I think the Providence loss was tough for them because Providence was really towards the bottom of the conference, and Temple in the Big East, the Philly Big 5 championship at the Finn, which was a great event, was a tough one as well. So the WBIT starts on March 20th. We'll find out in the next week or so if Villanova will get a bid, accept a bid, and see if that's a home game. So we'll find out soon. We'll take our final break here at Villanova Sports Talk. When we come back, we'll quickly recap our thoughts on the poll questions. Last chance to vote on my Twitter, at WXVU David S. We'll also give you an update on what's happening at Madison Square Garden right now between Butler and St. John's. David Szczepanski, Stephen Cain. We'll be right back after this.